You feel the heat first. Not from the sun, from below. Metal pressed against your back, warm at first, then hot, then searing. You can't move. The bronze walls curve around you in perfect darkness. And then you hear it, the scrape of iron, the crackle of kindling, and voices outside, laughing. They are lighting the fire beneath you. You scream. But when your scream leaves your throat, it doesn't sound like you anymore. It sounds like music. This isn't fiction. This isn't metaphor. For over 2,000 years, across continents and cultures, human beings engineered death not as an ending, but as theater. As art. As a message written in agony so profound that centuries later, we still can't look away. Today, we're not talking about the sanitized versions you read in textbooks. We're talking about the methods so visceral, so calculated in their cruelty, that they were designed to be remembered forever. And they were. Before we step into that darkness together, I have to say, it still amazes me that people from every corner of the world come here to witness these stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. There's something powerful about sharing this history, no matter how brutal it is. The man's name was Paralaus. He was an artist, a metalworker from Athens with a gift for sculpture and an even greater gift for ambition. Sometime around 560 BC, he traveled to Sicily with a creation he believed would change his life. It did. Just not the way he imagined. The island was ruled by Phalaris, a tyrant whose appetite for cruelty was matched only by his appreciation for innovation. When Paralaus unveiled his masterpiece, a life-size bull cast in gleaming bronze, Phalaris leaned forward. The bull was beautiful. Hollow. And inside, Paralaus explained with barely concealed pride, were tubes. Acoustical chambers designed to transform human screams into the melodious bellow of an animal. A person could be locked inside, a fire lit beneath, and as they roasted alive, the tyrant could sit outside and listen to music. Phalaris smiled. He asked Paralaus to demonstrate. The sculptor hesitated. But ambition is a trap, and he climbed inside. The door sealed. The fire was lit. And for the first and only time, Paralaus heard his invention work exactly as intended, his own voice, distorted into the mournful cry of a bull. Phalaris let him cook just long enough to appreciate the acoustics, then had him dragged out, still alive, and thrown from a cliff. The bull, after all, had to remain pristine. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus recorded this in his Bibliotheca Historica, treating it not as legend, but as fact. Cicero referenced it centuries later in his orations, calling it the Bull of Phalaris, in which the most cruel of all tyrants was accustomed to place men for punishment. Modern scholars debate whether it ever truly existed, or whether it was ancient propaganda meant to illustrate the depths of tyranny. But here's the thing, we know for certain that other methods just as horrific were real. And if those happened, why not this? The brazen bull wasn't just an execution. It was a statement. It said, "Your suffering is my entertainment. Your final moments are my symphony. And everyone who hears this story will remember what happens to those who displease me." If the brazen bull lives in the gray zone between history and myth, what comes next is chillingly certain. It was written into law, practiced for centuries, and reserved for a crime the Romans considered so unnatural that the very earth would reject the perpetrator's blood. The crime was parricide, the murder of one's father or parent. And the punishment was pena culiae, the penalty of the sack. It began with a beating. Rods wielded by officials until the condemned could barely stand. Then came the wolfskin hood, pulled over their head. Wooden clogs were fitted to their feet, an ancient precursor to cement shoes. And then, bleeding and hooded, they were sewn into a sack made of oxhide. But they weren't alone. Into the sack went a dog. A monkey. A snake. Sometimes a rooster. The choice of animals wasn't random, it was symbolic, each creature representing a perversion of nature, just as the crime itself was seen as a perversion of the family bond. The sack was loaded onto a cart, paraded through the streets, and then hurled into the nearest river. Inside, the victim would drown. But not quickly. Not peacefully. They would spend their final minutes in absolute darkness, tangled with panicking animals, claws, teeth, coils, while water rushed in through the seams. Cicero, the great Roman orator, tried to explain the philosophical necessity of this horror. The crime of parricide was so foul, he argued, that the killer's body could not be allowed to touch the earth, the sea, or even the beasts. The sack was the barrier, the container that kept corruption from spreading. The historian Livy recorded the case of Marcus Publicius Malleolus, executed this way after murdering his mother. Seneca the Younger noted that Emperor Claudius was so fond of pena culiae that he ordered it more frequently than crucifixion. And it didn't end with Rome. Modified versions appeared in 14th century Germany. In one documented case, the sack split open when it hit the water, and the dog and cat swam free. The man drowned alone. There's a detail in the Roman legal code that haunts me. It specifies that the victim must not be allowed to see the sky or be touched by the earth. Even in death, they were to be exiled from the natural world. As if the universe itself had turned its back. Pedro de Valdivia should have seen it coming. By 1553, he had spent years in Chile, leading Spanish conquistadors deeper into Mapuche territory, driven by rumors of gold. The indigenous Mapuche resisted fiercely, and on Christmas Day, Valdivia's forces were ambushed. He tried to flee on horseback, but the animal became trapped in a marsh. He was dragged back, bound, and brought before the Mapuche leaders. Some accounts say they ripped his heart out and consumed it. But another version, recorded by fellow conquistador Pedro Merino de la Barra, claims they poured molten gold down his throat. It wasn't just murder. It was poetry. A final, burning taste of the greed that had driven him across an ocean and into their land. Scientists who have studied this method estimate that death would have been swift, seconds at most. The molten metal would vaporize tissue instantly, rupturing the lungs and triggering catastrophic shock. But those seconds would have been unimaginable. The Romans used molten metal, too. Not gold, but lead. Emperor Constantine, in his Raptus statutes, prescribed it as punishment for a nurse who aided in the abduction of a female slave. The law is specific, almost poetic in its cruelty. The opening of their mouth and throat, which brought forth destructive encouragements, shall be closed by the swallowing of molten lead. The symbolism is inescapable. You spoke poison, so poison will silence you. You craved gold, so gold will kill you. These executions weren't just about ending a life. They were about crafting a narrative that would outlive the victim. Our only account of this method comes from Plutarch, a Greek historian writing about the Persians, Rome's long-standing enemies. That alone makes some scholars skeptical. Was Scaphism real, or was it anti-Persian propaganda? But the detail in Plutarch's account is so visceral, so specific, that it's hard to dismiss. The victim was a soldier named Mithridates. He had committed a grave offense. At a banquet, drunk on wine and arrogance, he boasted that he, not the king, had killed Cyrus, the king's rival brother. The king, Artaxerxes II, decided that Mithridates would die in a way that matched the magnitude of his betrayal. They placed him between two boats. One boat was inverted and set on top of the other, with his head, hands, and feet protruding through carefully cut holes. He couldn't move. Couldn't escape. Then the force-feeding began. Milk and honey were poured into his mouth until he was bloated and sick. If he refused to swallow, they pricked his eyes. But the milk and honey didn't stay in his mouth. They smeared it across his face. And then they left him floating in the sun. Within hours, his own body betrayed him. Diarrhea and vomit filled the space inside the boats. Flies swarmed. Maggots hatched. And as Plutarch describes it, creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption and rottenness of the excrement, and these, entering into the bowels of him, his body is consumed. Mithridates lasted 17 days. Modern forensic analysis suggests he would have died from dehydration, sepsis, or exposure long before insects could fully consume his organs. But that doesn't diminish the horror. This wasn't an execution. It was a forced decomposition. A slow rot inflicted on a living man, designed to be witnessed, remembered, and feared. The Chinese called it ling qi, the lingering death. The West called it death by 1,000 cuts. Both names understate the reality. This wasn't a method reserved for the worst criminals. It was codified into law, practiced for centuries, and documented in photographs as late as 1905. The execution was an art form, and the executioner was an artist. His goal wasn't just to kill, but to sustain consciousness as long as possible. To make the body fail piece by piece while the mind remained aware. It often began with the chest and arms, thick cuts, non-lethal, removing chunks of flesh. Then the executioner would work downward, carving away muscle, fat, sinew. The final cuts were the most symbolic, the amputation of limbs, the severing of the head. This ensured the body was incomplete, which in Chinese belief meant the soul would remain mutilated in the afterlife. The process typically lasted 15 minutes. But there are reports, horrifying, detailed reports, of executions that stretched to 3,000 cuts over hours. The only mercy available was a bribe, either for a faster death or a dose of opium to dull the pain. One of the most famous victims was Li Si, a scholar and chancellor during the Qing dynasty. Betrayed by a political rival, Li Si was subjected to the 5 punishments, a progressive ladder of mutilation that culminated in Ling Qi. First, his nose was removed. Then his genitals. And finally, he was sawn in half in a public square. His last words, spoken to his son as the executioner approached, were heartbreaking in their simplicity. "I wish that you and I could take our brown dog and go out through the eastern gate of Shanxi to chase the crafty hare. But how could we do that?" It's a glimpse of the man beneath the punishment. A father. A dog owner. Someone who once chased rabbits in the morning light. And now, in front of a crowd, he was being disassembled. Ishikawa Gomen was Japan's Robin Hood. A 16th century bandit who stole from the wealthy and gave to the poor, he became a folk hero, until he attempted to assassinate a powerful warlord. When he was finally captured, the authorities wanted to make an example that would echo through generations. They chose boiling. The most common version of the story says Gomen was placed in a massive iron kettle along with his young son. As the fire beneath grew hotter, Gomen held his child above his head, keeping him out of the scalding water as long as his strength allowed. In some tellings, the boy was saved. In others, he wasn't. But Gomen's fate was certain. He sank into the boiling water and died. In England, Henry VIII briefly made boiling the mandatory punishment for poisoners. The king, paranoid about plots against his life, wanted the crime to carry the most fearsome deterrent imaginable. A witness to one such execution wrote that the victim roared mighty loud, and that women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw. Across Europe, boiling was the prescribed punishment for counterfeiters, those who clipped bits of precious metal from coins. It was considered treason, and the method was chosen specifically because it inflicted prolonged, visible agony. The message wasn't just, "Don't do this." It was, "Look what we're capable of." The Romans perfected the fusion of justice and entertainment. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, wasn't just an execution. It was a show. Thousands packed into arenas to watch criminals torn apart by lions, bears, leopards, even elephants. This wasn't gladiatorial combat. The condemned had no armor, no weapons, no chance. That's what made it damnatio, a sentence, not a fight. Even if a victim somehow killed a lion with their bare hands, another animal would be released immediately. Or a soldier would finish the job. The outcome was never in doubt. The result was a grotesque mimicry of an eagle, wings spread in death. Did it actually happen? No archaeological evidence has been found, no skeletal remains bearing this specific trauma. But the sagas repeat it. One account describes the execution of Halfdan, a local ruler, by the Viking Earl Einar. Earl Einar went up to Halfdan and cut the blood eagle on his back. In this fashion, he thrust his sword into his chest by the backbone and severed all the ribs down to the loins, and then pulled out the lungs. Another tells of Ivar the Boneless, who avenged his father's death by performing the blood eagle on King Aella of Northumbria. They caused the blood eagle to be carved on the back of Aella, and they cut away all of the ribs from the spine, and then they ripped out his lungs. A modern researcher concluded that while the procedure is anatomically possible, the victim would die long before it was complete, from blood loss, trauma, or lung collapse. But the Vikings weren't performing autopsies. They were sending messages. These acts, which scholars call conspicuous mutilation, were designed to be remembered, to be feared, to be retold. And they were. If you had to choose a death from this list, almost no one would choose this one. It's not the most painful. It's not the most dramatic. But it's the most visceral. The most psychologically annihilating. It's called rat torture. The technique was perfected by Diederik Sonoy, a Dutch military leader during the 80 Years' War in the 16th century. The mechanics were simple. The victim was laid on a table. A clay pot or metal cage containing several rats was placed on their bare stomach. Then the container was heated from the outside, usually with a torch or hot coals. The rats, trapped and panicking, had only one way to escape the heat: down. They would begin to burrow. Through skin. Through muscle. Through fat and organ tissue. Driven by desperation, they would tunnel into the abdominal cavity, chewing their way deeper as the heat intensified. The victim would feel every second of it. The scraping. The gnawing. The sensation of something alive moving inside them. This wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was designed to break the will. And it did. There are earlier, cruder versions. The Tower of London allegedly had a dungeon of the rats, where prisoners in the lowest cells were subjected to rising tidal waters that brought swarms of vermin. Some accounts claim the rats, driven by hunger, would chew flesh from the prisoners' arms and legs. But that was incidental. Sonoy's method was intentional. Calculated. Inescapable. There's a question we avoid asking when we talk about history like this. Why do we want to know? It's not morbid curiosity. Or at least, it's not just that. It's something deeper. These methods weren't accidents. They weren't crimes of passion. They were designed. Approved. Witnessed by crowds. Recorded by scholars. Passed down through generations. They were, in their time, justice. Entertainment. Statecraft. And the thing that haunts me most isn't the pain. It's the precision. The acoustical tubes in the brazen bull. The symbolic animals in the Roman sack. The progression of cuts in Ling Chi, designed to sustain consciousness as long as possible. These weren't acts of rage. They were acts of architecture.